And with an Israel-Lebanon ceasefire now in effect and U.S.-Iran nuclear talks set to resume this weekend, the Middle East is at a critical juncture. But the question is whether these fragile developments can hold. For more, we're joined by Paik Seunghoon, researcher at the Institute of Middle East Studies. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me to your show.
So a 10-day ceasefire has just gone into effect between Lebanon and Israel. And how do you think this affects the bigger picture between the U.S. and Israel? Iran.
Yes, the Lebanon-Israel ceasefire is certainly meaningful, but mainly as a secondary variable rather than the decisive one. What it does, above all, is lower the immediate risk of regional spillover through Hezbollah and created a slightly less combustible strategic environment. That in turn gives Washington more diplomatic bandwidth to concentrate on the central issues, which remains the U.S.-Iran track. So in that sense, the ceasefire is helpful because it stabilizes one front and creates some political space for broader diplomacy. But we should not overstate its significance. It does not resolve the core dispute. So the real point of contention are still Iran's nuclear program, the futures of the Strait Hormuz and sanctions relief, and the question of what kind of security guarantees either side is prepared to accept. So I would say this ceasefire is strategically useful, but not strategically decisive. So if it holds, it could improve the atmospheres for negotiation. If it collapses, it could certainly complicate them. But ultimately, a U.S.-Iran understanding will depend not on the southern Lebanon, but on whether Washington and Tehran can narrow their differences on enrichment, highly enrichment uranium stockpiles, and the sequencing of sanction relief and de-escalation.
Right, and US President Trump said that negotiations with Iran might take place in person over the weekend, and talks mediated by Pakistan are continuing. And do you think a deal is actually realistic before the ceasefire expires next week, or are we more likely looking at another breakdown?
I mean, a limited deal is realistic. A comprehensive deal before the ceasefire expires is too much less so. So at this stage, the diplomatic signal suggests that both sides are at least willing to explore whether a short-term arrangement is possible. Pakistani mediation appears to have helped keep channel open, and the public messaging from Washington suggests a desire to translate military pressure into some form of political outcome. But the underlying disagreement remains substantial, especially on the nuclear issues and the conditions surrounding maritime access and Strait of Hormuz. Yes, but there was a kind of like good mood because after the ceasefire of Lebanon and Israel, so there was a certain like good gestures of Iran that they were going to let through the Oman maritime area to actually let the Hormuz flow keep on going. So the most plausible outcome in the near term is not a grand bargaining, but an interim understanding, something narrower, more tactical, and more reversible. So that could mean an extension of the ceasefire, limited nuclear restraint by Iran, and some formula regarding enrichment of uranium, and perhaps a partial sanction or financial relief mechanism. So in other words, something that buys time, lower the temperatures, and allows both sides to claim progress without yet resolving the DPC disagreement. So yes, some form of agreement is possible before next week, but I think the more realistic expectation is a bridging arrangement rather than a final whole grand bargaining settlement.
Right, and you mentioned the nuclear issue just now, and this does appear to be the biggest sticking point. Is there a realistic middle ground here, or do you think this is a fundamental incompatibility that could sink the entire deal?
I mean, there's a possible middle ground, but yes, it is quite narrow and politically very difficult. But like the most realistic compromise is not total dismantlement on the one hand or unrestricted enrichment on the other. Rather, it would like take a form of limited time-bound framework, like freeze of nuclear enrichment, so caps on enrichment level, strict verification and monitoring, and some mechanism for reducing or exporting at least part of Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile. But it is out from Trump administration. But there are certain like argument that Iran will gonna send all their stockpile outside of their Iranian border. So if that happens, yeah, definitely there will going to be a middle ground could be created. So in exchange for phase and conditional sanction relief, yeah, there's a lot of option that kind of built and strengthen the middle ground. And technically, that kind of formula is conceivable. The real problem is that the disagreement is not merely technical. It is also deeply political and strategic. So Washington wants credible assurance that Iran cannot move rapidly toward weaponization. Tehran, meanwhile, wants recognition of its sovereign nuclear right. So, like tangible sanction relief and some confidence that diplomacy will not simply be followed by renewed coercion. So this is not just an arms control negotiation. It is also a negotiation about trust, sequencing, and political intent. That is precisely why the middle ground exists in theory, but is so difficult to sustain in practice. But I would not yet call it fundamentally incompatible, because like what I said, there are certain element and certain variables, certain package that we're going to bring, enlarge and strengthening the middle ground.
Right, and going into some other factors that are weighing in on this possible deal, do you think the U.S. naval blockade pressure will, force Iran into a deal, or does it risk escalating the situation beyond the point where diplomacy can still work?
In truth, it does both. So on the one hand, the naval blockade clearly increased pressure on Iran. It raises the economic cost of continued defiance, constrains Iran's room for maneuver, and strengthens Washington's bargaining position. From a coercive diplomacy perspective, it is meant to signal that time is not on Tehran's side. But pressure and diplomacy do not always move in parallel. The more expensive and prolonged blockade becomes, the greater risk of miscalculation, confrontation at sea, and the cycle of escalation in which both sides feel compelled to demonstrate resolve rather than flexibility. So, and once that dynamic takes hold, diplomacy becomes much harder because concession begins to look like weakness rather than strategy. So the blockade may help bring Iran to the table, but it cannot by itself produce a durable agreement. So I think I hope this could be the answer to your question, but I do believe it does both.
All right, thank you so much for your insight today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.